Evolution of Crisis Theory Within Social Work Practices by Kristen Hopwood, Angela Hernandez, Shamika Harrison, and Caitlin Holland. Social work theories help practitioners understand their clients' behaviors. The crisis theory is a researched lens that social workers can use when helping a client who is experiencing crisis or trauma. Most of us will experience some form of crisis in our lifetime. Social workers will work with someone who is in a crisis state at some point in their career. Having knowledge of the crisis theory and intervention can be a helpful tool for the practitioner. A crisis is an event that leads to temporary state of psychological disorganization or inability to function as one ordinarily might. A crisis can be personal, such as the death of a loved one or loss of a job. It can be an external event, such as an earthquake or flooding. It is the effect on the individual, the sudden onset of the event, in addition to the immediate need for assistance, that makes the problem become a crisis. When the crisis event occurs, the amount of stress is increased. The stress can become chronic or cause physical or psychological damage to the client. There are 4 principles to the crisis intervention. The crisis intervention is time limited and short. Engagement and assessment occur effectively and at the same time. The fundamental purpose of crisis intervention is to meet concrete and emotional needs through the provision of services. And finally, the intervention must move quickly, seeking to help a client return to their previous levels of function.
A crisis can be an external event that has a negative effect on a person to where there is immediate need for assistance. This assistance can be found through a crisis intervention, which is a focused short-term intervention seeking to resolve a crisis. You can find crisis interventions being used through a clinical or direct practice setting, but also through specific crisis-oriented agencies. But really, social workers have to be prepared to conduct crisis interventions when working with any and all of their clients, because anyone can be subject to a crisis at any time. That means social workers have to be prepared to work with diverse populations with a variety of crises and traumas. We can see our diverse client systems in hospitals where there are patients who have experienced physical or psychological traumas, maybe in neighborhoods where people are encountering continuous violence or even just witnessing this violence. We can see it with people who have been through catastrophic natural disasters and are trying to deal with the aftermath. Crises look different on everyone, and they can be experienced anywhere at any time. It's very important that crisis interventions must be voluntary, and it cannot be turned into disaster management. Most social workers will follow Robert's 7-stage model in crisis intervention when conducting crisis interventions. And that's where he starts first with a biopsychosocial or other assessments to assess and collect data on your client. And then he leads into building a collaborative relationship. And this established relationship is very important in order to go on to the next stages of identifying major problems, including the crisis precipitants, and encouraging the explorations of feelings and emotions, then leading to developing new coping strategies, where then we focus on restoring functioning through an action plan. And lastly, the use of follow-up and booster sessions to make sure your client is processing their crisis in a way where they can be successful later on in life.
Looking at the strength of crisis theory with diverse client systems, it allows for the social worker to assess the situation, build rapport, and offer different resources to provide different strategies that can assist the client in coping with different crises. Crisis looks different for each individual, just like success does. So when looking at this theory, it allows for different approaches to help provide the proper support and skills in order to overcome the different crises the client may be experiencing. Additionally, finding ways in which to build up different coping skills that the client can use so that they can have the ability to overcome that crisis themselves if they were to experience it again. Crisis will occur and it will be difficult, but crisis theory allows for the social worker to help the client learn and grow within themselves. Coping skills look different for each person as well, and this theory allows for a space in which the social worker can assist the client in finding what works for them. Crisis theory overall helps the client to learn new ways of coping with the challenges they're facing, but overall becomes stronger from it.
The most significant and recognized limitation to crisis theory is that it seeks to provide interventions which quickly address temporary episodes of crisis. This rapid intervention typically lasts no more than a few weeks. This allows little time for the social worker to fully assess the possibility of long-term, perhaps even permanent effects of the original stressful, precipitating event. Often individuals may attempt to utilize coping mechanisms to work through these stressors. However, when those mechanisms fail to relieve the stress, it brings about even higher levels of frustration and stress. When these high levels of stress persist longer than a few weeks, it can lead to what is known as chronic stress. Chronic stress can cause long-term psychological damage, which quick interventions simply cannot support. Langer and Leitz identify the first step in crisis theory as prevention, stating that when possible, preventing the occurrence of a traumatic event is preferable, relying on an individual's ability to assess and identify their own stress signals. When an individual lacks insight and fails to identify those signs, it is virtually impossible to rely on this method of intervention. Also, since a crisis can occur as a result of natural disasters, as well as personal stressors, including unexpected loss, the concept of crisis prevention remains unfitting to the many people whose crisis cannot be avoided or prevented. Depending on the level of crisis, Langer and Leitz state that the social worker may attempt to assist an individual back to their normal state of functioning by assessing concrete resources like food and shelter, or psychological resources like recognition of strengths and naturally occurring increased self-esteem. The limitation to these interventions are, again, these interventions are only relevant to individuals who possess the skills needed to be able to identify their strengths. When an individual is unable to attain increased self-esteem, they will not benefit from these psychological resources. Overall, with its limitations, crisis theory has been proven to be an effective evidence-based practice and continues to be utilized by social workers during their interventions with a variety of different people from all walks of life.